Hello, I hope you're all able to join us here at Canning House. My name's Jeremy Brown. I'm the Chief Executive of Canning House. And this afternoon in London, if you're joining us from the Americas this morning, we're looking at the election that took place on Sunday in El Salvador. Obviously, a very dramatic election with an extraordinary outcome in terms of the share of the vote for a single candidate. Which clearly is a reflection on what has happened in El Salvador in the last 5 years and what people hope and expect to happen in the next 5 years, but also has wide-based ramifications, I would say, for the wider Latin America and indeed the wider democratic world. Some of the questions it throws up about democracy, about process, about voter expectations. So we're really enthusiastic about putting on this webinar this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, Canning House is the premium forum here in Britain for relations between Britain and Latin America. So we make it our business to constantly look at what is happening in Latin America. In this case, the politics and elections, but we're also looking at business and trade, commercial, cultural, historical issues as well. And we are determined that no election should ever take place in Latin America without us at Canning House giving it close inspection and trying to add some real value as well, not just what you might read in the Financial Times or The Economist or whatever it might be, but some really insightful discussion from a range of different panelists with expertise, so they can sort of shed light on what you've read elsewhere and try and add to your sum of knowledge. So thank you everyone for joining us. What we're going to do is the four speakers are going to speak for around about 7-8 minutes each, set out their stall, explain the situation as they see it in El Salvador. And then after that, we'll go into a general conversation, try and weave in a few questions if people wish to ask them. And we're going to wrap the whole thing up in an hour and a quarter. We always think that an hour's not quite enough and an hour and a half's a bit too much. So we've got an hour and a quarter. So UK time from 3 o'clock till 4:15 in the afternoon for this event. And I think let's take it from there. So let's work on the assumption that people know basically what happened. President Bukele won with a extraordinary share of the vote, around about the mid-80s percentage vote share. Of course, incredibly successful in the other elections on the same day as well. So here to look at that, explain it, what the implications are, the ramifications. We've got our panel. So first up is Professor Christine Wade, who's Chair of Political Science at Washington College, and she is joining us to set the sort of broad scene and to explain what happened. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to Canning House for hosting this conversation this morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Jeremy said, I've been tasked to be the scene setter for our discussion of Sunday's elections in El Salvador, which have effectively transformed the country into a one-party state. Bukele now has a mandate for a second, albeit unconstitutional term, following a regional trend of successive unconstitutional re-election in the region. And to say that Sunday's election was deeply flawed would be an understatement. Late changes to vote allocation rules, redistricting, withholding of public campaign financing for other parties, and a host of irregularities made it virtually impossible for smaller parties to survive. And this is beyond voting and campaigning during a state of exception, which of course we saw the presence of military and police, not only in the lead up to election day, but at polling places on election day, which should raise very serious questions for us. In addition to this, the collapse of the Electoral Tribunal's computing system and the decision to reopen vote abroad are extremely troubling. These are some of the issues that I expect Manuel and Antonella will be interested in talking to you about today. My task here is to provide some regional context for you about El Salvador's experience with democracy, which I think we would all agree has been rather uneven. And since El Salvador's transition to democracy in the post-war era, which began really with the much heralded 1994 elections of the century, the country has had regular, free, and fair elections, which isn't to say that there haven't been irregularities, there have, but none so much as to affect the outcome of elections, perhaps with the exception of the second round in 2014 when two major parties enlisted the assistance of gangs to boost voter turnout. But between 1994 and 2019, Salvadoran politics was really dominated by the two parties most closely associated with the Civil War. Arena, the right-wing Nationalist Republican Alliance, which was founded by Death Squad leader, and the FMLN guerrillas, or formerly guerrillas, right, that fought the government of El Salvador during the Civil War, along with a variety of smaller parties representing the center-left and further right of the spectrum. And this duopoly, right, generally ensured that no political party held too much power. And while imperfect, courts, institutions demonstrated relative independence across a variety of issues. Court rulings were generally respected by public officials. And that's not to say that there haven't been serious issues or tensions, because there have been. But El Salvador's institutions generally functioned better than most of its neighbors. There were, of course, really serious issues that dominated post-conflict politics. Two in particular that were always on the minds of voters were the economy and violence. And we do have people who are going to speak to this today. The peace accords ended the war. They were transformative in many respects. They facilitated the redesign of institutions, but they did nothing to address the country's socioeconomic issues. And so El Salvador's economy was stagnant, or has been stagnant, for roughly about 2 decades. Neoliberal policies choked public services, dollarization delivered inflation, the cost of living was the highest in the region, and the country became dependent on remittances from abroad. Alongside this, El Salvador experienced the world's highest homicide rate at times, homicide and femicide rates. More than 75,000 Salvadorans lost their lives in the Civil War, but tens of thousands more lost their lives during the peace. And the mano dura policies, the so-called iron fist policies that successive governments of both main parties implemented, merely exacerbated the crisis. And as a result, we had tens of thousands of Salvadorans migrating or planning to migrate. These factors not only eroded trust in El Salvador's political parties, but undermined trust in governing institutions and satisfaction with democracy. Myself, Diana Arasburu, and Mary Malone have a piece, in fact, on Canning House blog about this issue, if you'd like to take a look at that. So unsurprisingly, by the late 2010s, the model was beginning to exhaust itself. Neither party was capable of delivering meaningful change or offering solutions to the country's most pressing problems. So in comes Nayib Bukele, a 2-term mayor for the FMLN, who rode a wave of anti-incumbent, anti-system sentiment in the 2019 elections by positioning himself as an outsider, which is a feat that really only an accomplished PR exec could accomplish. But his influence over the transition of the political system began even before he was a candidate for president, when he urged a boycott of the 2018 legislative elections that dramatically cut into the FMLN's vote share. Of course, Bukele won the 2019 elections with 53% of the vote, and in 2021, his party gained a supermajority in the legislative elections. And it's with this supermajority that Bukele has been able to subvert democratic institutions and the rule of law, such as replacing members of the Constitutional Court, which ruled favorably for his reelection. But his authoritarian tendencies were really noticeable much sooner. Whether we call him a populist or an autocrat, there's no denying that Nayib Bukele is certainly popular. He has the highest approval ratings in the hemisphere, and that was true throughout the entirety of his first term. And in fact, there's been a significant satisfaction with democracy amongst Salvadorans during his first term. Much of Bukele's popularity rests with his security strategies, most notably the now 22-month-long state of exception, under which some 75,000 Salvadorans have been rounded up and imprisoned without due process. And while I think we might and should contest the success and sustainability of this policy, it's certainly one of the reasons why Salvadorans turned out for him in such big numbers on Sunday, including record turnout for the vote abroad crowd in the United States and elsewhere. But heading into his second term, Bukele is going to have to also confront other issues, namely the economy. With food insecurity, poverty, public debt, and inflation on the rise, there will inevitably be pressure on Bukele in his second term to address the state of the economy. And he had previously championed Bitcoin as a solution to many of the country's problems. That has not borne out. But it will be time, as we say, right, soon to pay the piper for Bukele on the economy in his second term. And I think I'll leave it there before I step on too many other toes this morning.
Christina, Christina, thank you. So you caught me up by being so good on your timekeeping.
You had no idea I would be a good
I
time.
always ask speakers to be very disciplined, and such a rarity that it actually happens that it caught me up. Christine, thank you. That's it's great to set the scene and plenty of controversy up front there, but let's not get to that yet. We will come back. So if people agree strongly or disagree strongly with some of those observations, contain yourself, and we will come to you in due course. Now, I think Manuel, who I was going to come to next, has dropped out. So can I swap the batting order? Antonella, are you okay to go next?
Antonella's, I'm happy to go now.
Academic over in San Diego was going to be third in our order, but I'll switch you up to second. So, Antonella, thank you for jumping up, and over to you.
Sure. So I think I want to start also making some observations on Bukele's style and how he governs, to think a little bit about the facts or the topics that you asked me to comment on. I think thinking about his style can help us characterize how he got reelected, on how he was able to manage to promote such a bad electoral reform. So I would say, like, one of the main traits of Bukele, and I think I'm not alone noting this, is that he has no attachment really to any ideology that's not functional to his objectives. So in this sense, when he realized, for example, that checks and balances were an obstacle because they could lead to investigations on deals with the gangs or incipient corruption scandals, he did many things to dismantle any institution that would check his power, and in particular harass the media or intervene the judicial power. And I think this is complementary to maybe another one of his traits. And I think this is really important in the different strategies that he has implemented, and that is that for him, facts are not really that important. What is important is the narrative surrounding the facts. So, for example, and we have seen this more recently, when the Constitution says he can't get reelected, and he's on record saying the Constitution forbids a person to run 2 consecutive mandates, he attacks the origins of the Constitution, claiming, for example, that the right wing wrote it, that Tabuzon wrote the Constitution. So I think these are important facts to understand kind of the re-election and the electoral reform and the impact of the high crime rates of El Salvador on his popularity. I think we all know how high the approval rates of Bukele are, and probably most people know that by the time he came into power as the president of the country, very few people in El Salvador had a positive view of democracy. So if we look at data from LAPOC, from Latinobarometer, El Salvador ranked really low as in terms of support for democracy, if we look at Latin America as a whole. Now, the idea that the Constitution should be reformed is not recent, right? It's not something that happened a couple of months ago. So he had asked, for example, back in September 2020, I think, to Felix Ulloa to look at the articles of the Constitution that could be reformed. And even before then, and since then, several events took place that point to this increasing concentration of power. I think there's like a good way to kind of get a sense of what has been going on in El Salvador is to look at the video in which Bukele announced so there's this recording from when Bukele announced he was running for a second term, and he is in this beautiful room. And he says, okay, so I'm going to run for a second time. And we see, like, in the same video, in the same room, the president of the Supreme Court signing his approval, doing like a thumbs up. And we see the attorney general smiling next to him, which talks a little bit to this very, the idea that there's some kind of separation of powers is completely dead. And this is the first time this has happened since El Salvador is a democracy, right? Since 1992. So other examples that may be less like theatrical, but more substantive in nature includes, for example, the gerrymandering of municipalities. So we know that Bukele has eliminated like hundreds of municipalities, or actually fused them together in this new electoral reform that it's very easy to see that will be really bad for small political parties and will benefit these Nuevas Ideas because it's going to fuse districts in which his party does not do very well with other parties. There's also like some other very weird things like having the votes from people abroad count for San Salvador. So, okay, I think it's very well established that there has been like this very intense move toward authoritarianism, but despite this fact, Bukele is extremely popular. And I think it's important to note something maybe we mentioned already, is that we don't even know what the results of the election are. Like if somebody knows, maybe they can tell us, but there were very serious irregularities that took place on Sunday that have never been seen since 1992. For example, if you looked at the website of the Tribunal Electoral on Sunday, at one point you could infer there would be more than 100% turnout if you look at the amount of people that should have been voting, considering how many of the tables have been counted, or the suspension of the vote count, etc. So very irregular. We don't really know how many people are supporting Bukele, but he's very popular, right? It's not necessary to debate this, and this is clearly linked, and Christine mentioned this, to the war on gangs. I think this is perhaps a little bit uncomfortable for some of us because while the policies are indeed very brutal and very inhumane, they have changed the daily lives of many people who live in territories that were formerly controlled by gangs. So I think it's important to unpack this a little bit to think about the challenges that lie ahead. So if we remember the first months of Bukele's first term, so he did not initially declare a war on gangs. He actually was alleged, it is alleged he made a truce with the gangs, but this like kind of first phase of peace and truce kind of broke down in March 2022 when they went on a killing spree, and one day they killed more than 80 people on a single day. Then he declared the state of emergency, or the state of exception that we still have today, and that allowed him to take a hold of these urban and rural places that have very heavy gang presence. Now, what happened after, it's a bit different to what we usually think when we think about mano dura policies in Latin America, because it was very successful. Mano dura policies in Latin America generally fail and are generally implemented as like this kind of strategy to focus or make salient security issues while some other reforms are implemented. This was not the case, and actually it was very, very successful in that the gangs were truly pulverized, and nobody disputes this fact, right? Even El Faro, which is a publication that has generally investigates Bukele and is like the main opposition, I would say, now in the country, agrees that the gangs were completely disarmed, mostly because he undermined their territorial presence and like cut off their financing, which came primarily through extortion. Now, the thing is that this brought really real, tangible benefits to people that were living in these areas. They don't have to pay fees. They can do something as simple as going out or being visited by their family members who live in territories that were formerly controlled by other gangs. So this really changed the lives of many people, right? But we also know that this has happened at the expense of like this systematic violation of human rights. El Salvador now has proportionally a larger carceral population than other heavy carceral states like China or the US. And we also know that hundreds of people have died under their custody. No one is facing due process. The conditions in which they're held are really, really bad. So this brings us to like the now what question, like what is going to happen in El Salvador? And I think I want to leave it at two small points that speak to the idea that how problematic it is that the popularity of Bukele is linked to these undemocratic policies. So I think that a general point or takeaway for Latin America as a region is that we need to think about how to deal with organized crime a lot more. And if we care about human rights, we have to acknowledge that criminal governance is really brutal for a lot of people, and if we don't find solutions or provide evidence that there are ways in which we can combat criminal organizations and criminal governments in ways that respect human rights, we will observe more of these policies. So it is not news for anybody that support for democracy is in decline. So it is a very dangerous context to see these types of policies succeeding for our region. Now, in terms of the domestic front, for me, it's hard to imagine something that doesn't go in the direction of more like a deepening of the concentration of power. Because if we look like Bukele did not make a lot of campaign promises, at least I couldn't find like a platform or a government plan. And we know that there's some investigations that are a little bit compromising in the sense that, okay, so we know now we have some evidence that he was negotiating with Mexican cartels and stuff like that. So it's not clear that gangs can really just disappear from El Salvador and everything will be fine, okay? So more than 1% of the population is behind bars. We don't know if this is sustainable, but maybe more important, the structural factors that fed gang recruitment and gang violence are all still there. El Salvador is more poor, and 1 second and I'll finish. El Salvador is more poor, the public debt is increasing, so I leave it at that so that we have the macro comments then that I think are very linked to this. Sorry if I went over time.
Antonella, thank you for your remarks. You didn't go by much, so we're fine. Now I was going to come to Manuel Melendez from Harvard University, but he's still not rejoined us. We hope he will. So in the meantime, Ramiro from Bank Trust, do you mind jumping in now, Ramiro? Ramiro is going to he's on the line from Buenos Aires, and he's going to particularly focus on more economic aspects of the election, or the outcome of the election on Sunday. So Ramiro, over to you.
Fantastic. So first of all, let me do a small summary of the message I want to convey to you. I will try to stick very strictly to the time frame, that the allotted time. So first of all, it is true that growth has been disappointing in El Salvador relative to regional peers, but our view is that we cannot blame it on dollarization, but instead on an overly expansive fiscal policy that has led to soaring spreads, very high borrowing costs, and as a result, a very low investment rates. Dollarization actually means, it doesn't mean that you cannot gain competitiveness. It means that you cannot use the exchange rate to, find an easy way to gain competitiveness. Instead, you must do it the hard way. But the good thing here is that it is also the most enduring way over time. And also, I would like to pick on a point that Christine mentioned, in the sense that institutions, there is evidence that suggests that institutions are not worse than the regional peers. So why is this important? Because it means that once you correct the fiscal accounts, and once you overhaul El Salvador's fiscal situation, it's very likely that you will see a very fast catch up. So without much further ado, this first chart, I think it shows very clearly why Bukele has won the election by a landslide. He has essentially decreased crime it's now 10% the murder rate what it was before he took office in June 2019. And this is important also from an economics point of view, because it will have important implications in terms of tourism, which is one of the nascent industries that El Salvador can develop from now onwards. But now the situation is completely different because, okay, now we have seen society has been a sharp reduction in crime, but what comes next? I mean, now, if you see this slide, I think it speaks by itself. It's a poll conducted by Fundango, which is a local pollster based on 1,200 respondents. Well, now people are less concerned about crime and safety. Look the way this has declined substantially since December 2021, but now people are demanding much better economic conditions. 70% of respondents think that the main problem is the economy. And this is also very much aligned with what we are seeing in terms of living standards, because if you look at poverty rates, well, average poverty and extreme poverty is around twice as much in El Salvador. Poverty is 30% and extreme poverty 8%. It's almost twice as much as its regional peers. For instance, let's take Panama, let's take Dominican Republic, let's take Costa Rica. So there is a legitimate, I would say, concern from the point of view of society in terms of the need of improving living standards, and this will probably be the challenge for Bukele's second term. What I was saying at the beginning, dollarization has only been a partial solution, and in terms of lowering inflation, but it has not really by itself worked to jumpstart growth, which if we look at this chart, it is clear that growth is well below its regional peers, Honduras and Guatemala in the Northern Triangle here, and also other countries in Central America. It's almost 1.6 percentage points below the average of Central America. It's also below Latin American six biggest economies here. And also, it's only right now catching up with the other dollarized economies in the continent, which are Panama and Ecuador. But this has also, I think that if you look at that from the point of view of what has been the drivers of such low growth, well, the obvious driver is the lack of investment, low productivity, and this I'm going to address this in a second. But one of the reasons why this has happened is because there is a very low savings rate in El Salvador, and this is also hand in hand with what I was mentioning at the beginning, the fact that the fiscal accounts or the fiscal deficit has been excessively high, and this has eroded domestic savings. If we look at the savings rates here, at the far right, well, it's also well below its regional peers in Central America, in the Northern Triangle, and also the average of dollarized economies. And here I would like to focus about the opportunities, and then what are the tools needed in order to leverage on these opportunities that are brewing. Which are these opportunities? Well, on the one hand, we all know about the nearshoring story. Nearshoring story is basically the US trying to refocus from Asia and China into its neighboring, into the areas which are under its sphere of influence, namely South America and Central America. And here it's obvious, if we look at the historical trends, where El Salvador's competitive edge lies. There was an attempt to jumpstart exports by setting up the maquila industry in El Salvador, but it hasn't not really worked that well. If you look at the chart to the left, you will see that since the early 2000s, the textile industry, which is basically the core of the maquila, has expanded by 66%, while services have increased by 166%. These are exports, right? So I would say that this pretty much shows the point that El Salvador has a real competitive edge in terms of providing services. And within those services, we could think that tourism makes a lot of sense. I mean, and this is important, the slide I was discussing at the beginning, the sharp reduction in crime. Look at how crime has spiked after Bukele has addressed the security situation. It is 2.5 times higher than the average of 2005, 2015 by the end of 2023. So the two real opportunities El Salvador has at this moment is developing its services industry and also trying to overhaul tourism, which is, I think, the authorities understand this and they are on the process. The other main problem El Salvador is facing in order to achieve, to take advantage of these opportunities is essentially very low competitiveness. And why is competitiveness so low? On the one hand, we are seeing that wages, if we compare, if we focus again on the nearshoring story, well, wages are basically the same level as, on average, as in China. I mean, they're exactly, by the end of 2023, they are exactly equal in dollar terms. But look at what happened with productivity growth. Productivity growth in East Asia and the Pacific since 1991 has grown 8 times, while it has remained stagnant in El Salvador and in many other Central American economies. Interestingly, Panama, which is a dollarized economy and it's also a regional peer, has seen productivity growing twice as much as El Salvador. And this is, again, the lack of investment. I mean, the lack of investment here, we are seeing that compared to its regional peers, I mean, we are seeing El Salvador has a very low quality of infrastructure. Look, it's below Guatemala, it's below Honduras, and of course, it's well below OECD members. But in terms of its regional peers, there is a lag, which of course, it's noticeable in terms of what we have just said in terms of productivity growth. So here is the problem, how to jumpstart productivity, how to jumpstart investment when borrowing costs are excessively high. I mean, look at the chart to the right, where we see the sovereign risk premium and FDI as a percentage of GDP. When sovereign spreads were manageable, were quite low, you had FDI at around 3.7% of GDP, peaked in 2017. After, I mean, when we saw debt to GDP rising to unsustainable levels, which I will refer to now, we saw actually FDI becoming negative as a percentage of GDP. And only recently, with the decline in sovereign spreads, we have seen a very tepid pickup in FDI, but it's still not enough. So going into I would say, the key issue, which is fiscal accounts, which is the chart to the left, well, debt is still unsustainable. It is still well above the threshold for EM economies, which the IMF thinks it's a reasonable level in terms of debt to GDP, which is 70%. And if you extrapolate the 2022 fiscal trends, in which you have seen an improvement in terms of the primary surplus delivered by El Salvador, with a primary surplus of 1.9 percentage points of GDP, debt would remain constant as a percentage of GDP. So this fiscal effort is clearly not enough. So now, to end my presentation, just going back to what I said earlier about the rule of law, well, institutions are not really that different in El Salvador if we compare it to its regional peers. And this is a poll which has been conducted by the World Justice Project. If you see the blue dots, it says El Salvador, and the farther to the right, it's the worst you can be in terms of answers regarding how people think that, I mean, whether or not there is a persecution of the opposition, which is the first question, censorship for opposition groups. Well, as you can see, it's not that you can see El Salvador to the far left, to the far right, sorry. Rather, you can see it in the middle, or even in terms of the attacks on the judiciary, you see it in the center relative to its peers. And in terms of attacks on the media and misinformation, it fares better. So, I mean, rule of law, it's a problem. It's a long-term problem. It's going to be a hindrance for the whole of the region, not only for El Salvador, but it's not like El Salvador does worse than its regional peers, such as Guatemala or Honduras. So this means that if you address the fiscal situation, we have seen that growth disappointed relative to its regional peers. If you address the fiscal situation, there is room for a fast pickup. And I will leave it there and address questions, if any.
Ramiro, there's so much content in there. Thank you very much. And let's come back to some of those points you raised. But it was excellent and shed a lot of light, particularly on the economic situation. Manuel, you're back with us. We've demoted you from number 2 in the order to number 4. Demoted's the wrong way, reshuffled you. So you're our last speaker now. And over to you, and then we'll broaden it out into a wider conversation. Manuel.
Great, thank you. Great to be here. Sorry, everyone, I was hit by an unexpected internet blackout, and so I unfortunately missed most of the conversation. I want to make sure I don't sort of go over things again. So let me just say a couple of things quickly, and then we'll just turn it to Q&A. Ramiro, that was an extremely amount of useful information. I do want to start by putting that final slide in context regarding the condition of rule of law and institutional checks and balances in El Salvador. Would love to hear more about how these indicators are constructed. But the point of departure for any conversation about what the next 5 years hold is a clear and unambiguous understanding that this is now a condition where political and institutional power has been completely concentrated under the hands of one man. There is no meaningful rule of law remaining. There is no meaningful judicial independence. There is no equality of competition among competing political alternatives. There is very limited room for oversight. Every single agency that could exercise any sort of meaningful oversight over the actions of the executive has been defanged, packed, or removed. Whether quantitative indicators have caught up with that yet, or whether the quantitative indicators we use are correct, is an open question that we can discuss. So with that said, let me maybe talk about the international dimension of this. 2 things very briefly. The first is what has been the role of the international community in this election? And I think this is best exemplified by briefly thinking about what the US has done. Until the beginning of last year, the US was a fairly vocal critic of anti-democratic actions in El Salvador. A number of fairly high-level diplomats spoke, decisively about at key moments. The United States categorized some fairly powerful figures of the Bukelista orbit as corrupt and anti-democratic actors. This changed in February 2023 with the arrival of the new US ambassador. And what we saw starting then was a complete U-turn. The United States embraced the Bukele administration, and they have been some of the first and most effusive to congratulate Bukele after his reelection. This highlights a really important trade-off for the international community. This U-turn is many things, and we can talk about it in more detail, but what the United States U-turn basically reflects is this, what they would frame as this realization that speaking up for process, for rights, was accomplishing very little in terms of furthering their specific political objectives. In this case, reducing immigration. That's something that I think we can unpack, and we can talk about sort of how we think the international community should go about making those decisions. But I think it's an important trade-off to flag. The second point to make about the international community, and this is, I think, in some ways the most important, is the implications of this Bukele model for the rest of the region and for the world. And the real danger here is that it sets up these two trade-offs. Right? The first is this trade-off between popularity and democracy. And it's always useful for us to remember that democracy is not just a popularity contest. And people might vote and they might elect a leader, but whether that election and that regime is a democracy depends on a whole series of additional factors that have to do with process, not outcome. What Bukele has accomplished is he has been able to blur that distinction. And the international community, the press, has basically fallen for that trap. The second trade-off here is this trade-off between efficiency and democracy. The other idea that Bukele has been able to legitimize is this idea that give me some of your civil rights, give me some of your democratic checks and balances, and I will get things done. This also seems to have pretty problematic implications for democracy. So we have to think very seriously about these two things. It raises these questions of, what is the value of democracy? If democracy is not popular and if democracy is not efficient, why should we defend democracy? And I think one very obvious answer is that democracy is about the long run. It's fine to have an extremely popular president today. It's fine to have an extremely efficient president today. The reason checks and balances are essential for democracy is because they ensure that the extremely popular, effective president of today doesn't use his popularity to stay in power well past the point at which he has stopped being efficient and popular. So in some ways, a lot of us, myself included, are sort of waving our arms and saying this is not a democracy. And for a majority of Salvadorans, the costs of that may not be obvious today, but they will probably be obvious at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. I'll stop there and we can maybe take some questions.
Manuel, thank you very much for joining us and for talking so succinctly and powerfully. I'm gonna start by I want to address the big elephant in the room, which is that apart from perhaps Ramiro, the other three speakers, essentially, I think the main point you made was that this was a troubling election, that it represented a democracy in decline. It was not a democracy. There's gerrymandering. There's a flawed election. It's a one-party state, said Christine. 85% of people roughly voted for the guy. Now you can gerrymander as much as you like, but I mean, if 85% of people are voting for you, you're going to win almost wherever you draw the lines on you. I just want to put a sort of counter case, which is that it's not quite a counter case, but the big question that people are asking of democracies around the world, in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere, is can they deliver? Can they deliver the outcomes that people crave, whether it's around security or increased prosperity or tackling big, long-standing issues around climate change or aging populations or global security or whatever it might be? There's an anxiety that you pull the levers and things don't happen, that you vote for politicians and they never deliver. So you replace them with some other politicians, and they don't deliver either. This guy, no, he's coming from the people, one of the most dangerous, violent countries in the world, and reduced the murder rate by about 98%. Okay, there's a fair point, actually. Orlando Perez in the comments said it started coming down before Bukele came to power. But nevertheless, it has carried on going down dramatically. And so I suppose my challenge to everybody is, sure, process is important, but if democracy is a combination of process and outcomes, are we misunderstanding the electorate by getting so fixated on process and failing to realize that actually people are more fixated on outcomes? Or to put it one other way, Ramiro, really interesting. I thought they had interesting crime as an issue going down, interesting the economy as an issue going up. But I noticed Ramiro didn't comment on it. Next to that, who puts political and governance as their big concern? 2% of the population in El Salvador. But their big concern, the issue that we've overwhelmingly spoken about in our 45 minutes. We've talked about governance and systems. people in El Salvador are interested in violence and economic growth. Isn't that, have we got an electorate just on a completely different page from us? Anyone want to start on that one?
I mean, I don't
Kristen.
mind starting. I don't mind weighing in, Jeremy. I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that democracy is not solely about elections, right? I think a lot of people get really hyped up every 4 to 5 years, depending on their election cycle, about this idea of what voting will do for them. And I think that we have, in many instances in the Americas and through post-war peace building in El Salvador, certainly emphasized elections over institution building and governance. Right. And this is in part why we have such serious issues with rule of law in countries like El Salvador. But if you're worried about crime and you're worried about the economy, governance has to be central to that, right? Institutions matter, governance matters. These are the guide rails that keep policy on the tracks, so to speak. And so it does seem very academic. We are 3 political scientists.
The policy's not working. The policy isn't, but I mean, I've been meant to go around and say, I'm too scared to go outside. There are these violent gangs who are extorting people, murdering people. I stay inside. I can't live a normal life. I'm frightened the whole time. But they're meant to be pleased because all the people who've delivered this state of permanent terror and dysfunction are doing it within all these unelected people are doing it within these guidelines that make it all credible, and people should be grateful for it.
I don't think that they did
I'm putting the
Mano Duro within the
counter case, but
guidelines either. I mean, I don't think that they did Mano Duro within the guidelines either. I think Mano Duro itself is a bad policy. But it also creates, as Manuel says, this false equivalency between choosing between liberty and security. And that's what politicians in El Salvador have done very successfully for about 20 years now, is told people that they have to choose between these 2 things. That's what Bukele is telling people, that they have to choose between these 2 things because they don't have good governance. Good governance isn't a sexy conversation that makes great media splashes, right? It's the backdrop that creates good policy. And so if we don't have good governance, we're not going to have good policy.
You live in Ecuador and you are worried by escalating problems with violence and organized crime. Do you look at El Salvador and think, God, I hope we don't go down the path that they've gone down of bad governance? Or do you look at El Salvador and say, I hope we do go down the path that they've gone down of really getting tough on this problem and really doing something about it? Because that's some. And Antonella, do you have any particular views on?
So you mean like if I think that other countries should imitate Bukele's model?
Or do you think that? Well, I'm saying if you're a voter in Ecuador, do you look at that and think, thank God we're not like that? You know, we don't want anything like that in Ecuador. Or do you admire the results that Bukele has appeared to produce?
Yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways, like a bit presumptions to know what a voter that has to endure like the negative consequences of criminal governance should choose, and tell people like this is really bad for you, you should think about it, is like something that it's very uncomfortable, and at the same time I think Bukele is doing a good job exploiting, right? Like when in he self-proclaimed the winner of the election, and when he did that, he said like, oh, we're not letting like these foreigners tell us what democracy is or how we should govern. But I definitely don't think it's a good model. As I said before, I think it's very dangerous to think that these types of solutions are sustainable, like imprisoning like more than 1% of your population, doing it so like violating human rights. Many of the people are innocent. Many of the people who are behind bars are innocent, and at the same time, they are living in very terrible conditions. So I definitely think it's not something to emulate because it's very dangerous in the long term. So I think that's similar to what Manuel said, like if you think about the long term. So today it's fine because supposedly you have someone who's picking the right enemy and giving rights only to people who are good. But if that person is unchecked, how are you going to make sure that in the future you are not like giving or taking away rights from the so-called like good people, right? Like that is very dangerous to have one person decide who is a good person and who is a bad person. That is why the rule of law exists. And it's very interesting, like to me, that in a way, we keep forgetting how in the region we have seen this before. We have seen Chavez won elections, and like the same people that really are against that movement are saying, oh, but if Bukele is really popular, he must be doing something right. But we don't have to forget where these things end. It's very clear. We have seen this before.
Manuel, thank you.
Yeah, look, I think these are all great points, but a big danger here is conflating anti-crime policy with democratic backsliding. These are not the same thing. Imagine this world, or rather, let me put it this way. Bukele, beginning in May 2021, Bukele has a supermajority of the Legislative Assembly, and Bukele has a tremendous amount of what we sometimes call electoral slack. Huge room of maneuver to do whatever he sees best without seriously damaging his approval. Okay, beginning at that point, Bukele is in complete freedom to declare war against gangs. He's in complete freedom to call for a state of exception. His legislature, which was democratically elected, would have greenlit it, just as it did. Up to that point, this is not a story about democratic backsliding. This is not the stuff we're worried about up to this point. Nothing about Bukele's crime policy necessitated him to eliminate term limits. Nothing about his anti-crime policy necessitated him to gerrymander, to withhold funds from the opposition, to capture the electoral tribunal. In a democracy, the state of exception would have happened, gangs would have been hit, and then Nuevas Ideas, Bukele's party, would have nominated a successor, not named Nayib Bukele, and the people, understandably grateful, and that is fine, would probably have elected Bukele's successor by a wide margin.
Do you think term limits are too?
And the opposition, in the meantime, would have competed on even grounds.
Do you think term limits are too onerous? I mean, I'm British. We don't have any term limits here. Are they? But I find it personally a bit like the idea that a politician is standing for re-election. That keeps him or her a bit honest, that they know they have to face the electorate again. They know they have to be judged on their record in office. I personally, as a British person, found it strange when the Colombians went from a two-term model like the US down to a one-term model. Yeah, the day you get elected, you know you never have to face the electorate again. Is there a danger in Latin America that the desire to curtail abuse of executive power, understandable desire, has led to an overly onerous set of restrictions, which as a result have reduced accountability of politicians to their electorates? Because you have the situation like Chile, where you had with Piñera and Bachelet, where they were like ships in the night. They were the two big figures. They never allowed to stand against each other. They just sort of alternated in power. I can understand the checks and balances argument, but is there a danger that, as I say, that you end up unable to settle on a politician or a vision which over time can, with public consent, deliver outcomes which the electorate want? In the same way as we elected Tony Blair 3 times in a row in Britain, we elected Margaret Thatcher 3 times in a row in Britain. Was that a bad thing? Does that make Britain a more suspect democracy? Let's Ramiro, we haven't. Sorry, you don't have to directly answer these, but I'm just trying to. Ramiro, go, and then Tonello, you come back.
I just wanted to ask my fellow panelists who are experts on politics. I mean, what is so different if we compare El Salvador from the point of view of the quality of institutions and rule of law to other countries that are similar in many ways, and for instance, they are regional peers to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. I mean, I don't find so many differences. Perhaps there are, I'm not an expert, but where I do find a difference is in terms of the quality of economic policies, in terms of poverty, in terms of borrowing costs, which explains to a large extent the differential growth performance. So, I mean, if we are concerned from the point of view of institutions on El Salvador, well, it's actually not really a concern on El Salvador per se, but it's more a broader concern, including other countries in the region. It's more of a regional phenomena rather than focusing specifically on El Salvador. Maybe some of you can shed a little bit of light on this.
Very good. And to any of the points I was trying to get rolling, but I think comparing El Salvador with its obvious peer group in Central America is also interesting. And to any points you want to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go back to the re-election point. I think that, I mean, I think that's a very good point, and most like traditional political economy models show that re-election is actually quite a good incentive to motivate people to perform better while in office. And I think it's an important discussion. I think the main problem in the context of the Salvadoran election was that the constitution really explicitly banned it in 6 articles. And I think if the Salvadoran people want to change that, it's totally fine. They should hold like a convention constituyente and like ask the citizens what they think about this. And if they want to allow re-election, it's totally okay. I think the problem it's more about this happening because someone wishes to run again and who happens to be very popular, but also happens to be undermining the separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary, which is something that will prevent people from holding accountable in the future, right? And I think maybe a small comment, and I let Christine comment on Ramiro's question. I think yeah, the region is a very complicated region. Like what is the counterfactual, right? It's like, or what is the appropriate comparison? Nicaragua, which also has like these huge problems going on. I think when we're talking about Salvadoran institutions, and one of the comments in the chat was saying like, okay, but before there was criminal electioneering, and was that a better democracy? I think what we're worried about and the concern some of us share is this idea that if we look at El Salvador, it generally was a country in which presidents, the result of an election was not known beforehand, which is one of the definitions of democracy. There was independence from the judiciary, which is really important to hold accountable people that are not behaving good while in office. If you don't have that, and of course other countries in the region don't have that as well, but that doesn't make it better, at least in my opinion. And this is something that's new, that was not taking place in El Salvador. Do we prefer the gangs being there and making people really miserable? Of course not. Like one of my points when I was finishing my intervention was like, we have to really think about this, because of course criminal governance is really bad for people, and we need to provide better solutions that are not conflicted with the respect of human rights. But yeah, Christine, sorry.
Christine, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to remember that term limits have context, historical context in Latin America, and that when countries transitioned from dictatorships to democracy, one of the reason for term limits was to prevent exactly what we're seeing right now, right? Which was individuals perpetuating themselves in office for extended periods of time. Certainly, some countries have amended their constitutions through a democratic process to allow for re-election, maybe with a second term limit. El Salvador's has not been amended. El Salvador's constitution prohibits consecutive re-election. And as Manuel said earlier, what we would have seen in a normal democratic process is perhaps Nayib Bukele not running for this election cycle, someone else from Nuevas Ideas running, and Bukele would have been eligible to run again after the next election cycle. That's happened before in El Salvador. So there is important context for this. And of course, it's also important to remember that those processes exist for a reason, right? Nayib Bukele himself opposed exactly what he has done in both Honduras and Nicaragua. He chastised both Juan Orlando Hernandez and Daniel Ortega for doing exactly what he himself is doing now, right? So we know
Christine,
that at one point,
I think it's fascinating
Nayib Bukele opposed it himself.
Fascinating as a liberal because the processes clearly exist for a reason, and they are to protect the public from the abuse of power. So, and what I find so fascinating about El Salvador is that the public have almost given their consent to not being protected from the abuse of power. There's mostly people are very sort of up in arms when the rules are distorted in order to favour an outcome that a given politician wishes to achieve. And yet, tell me if I'm wrong, but this time the public seemed to be aware that the rules were being subverted, and didn't mind, or even, actively gave their enthusiastic consent to it. And then you're in a really weird position, because then your question is who do these rules exist for? Are they an abstract thing, or are they in order to sort of achieve outcomes, a certain type of society?
You know, Jeremy, it's interesting because I thought the same thing about Nicaragua in 2011. If the Nicaraguan people want Daniel Ortega to run for president for a third term, which was constitutionally prohibited, then why shouldn't they be allowed to do so? And if we look at Nicaragua now, I think that's what some of us here are concerned is the trajectory for El Salvador.
Understood. Do you think will run again in 5 years' time, everyone? Who knows? But if you had to bet now, is the cool dictator a long-term thing, or is it a 10-year project?
I think he
Manuel. Go on, Christine.
No, I think he seems to think so. I mean,
He's in for
otherwise, if you were interested
long haul.
in developing the party, you would be developing leadership within your party apparatus, and that's not happening within Nuevas Ideas.
There is absolutely no chance that Bukele doesn't run again, either in reality or de facto.
You think you're going on now? You don't think he'll feel that 5 years wasn't enough to deliver his vision, but 10 years is, and he'll bow out voluntarily in 5 years' time?
One of two things is going to happen. He's either going to run himself, or he'll follow the kind of now very popular model of being a shadow president. Right? Yeah. You appoint a loyalist, and you are the power behind.
Like Putin did.
Yeah, there would have to be an extraordinary number of things. An extraordinary number of things would have to happen between now and 2029 to change that general outlook. We can't discard him having some sort of existential crisis, waking up one day and being a different person. Barring that and barring something extraordinary, it's completely clear.
And let's. I'm getting some comments saying that I'm being controversial. I'm interested to explore why. And I'm in favour. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal. I want to see due process and the rule of law, but I think it's beholden on everybody to understand why a candidate is winning the support of 85% of the electorate. And I suppose it comes back to this point about why people appear in El Salvador to be content. They may be mistaken to be. It may have longer-term consequences which they have not foreseen, which come back to bite them. But in the short term, they seem to be content to suspend or at least downgrade the rules which were presumably designed to protect them in order to achieve policy outcomes which they think are important to them. And that's interesting, because I think there's a wider questions about the ability of democracy to deliver outcomes that people want. You see all over the world an appetite for, if I'm being kind, more sort of decisive leadership. than people feel some of the current democracies are delivering. And so I think we're at a bit of an inflection point, and that's why El Salvador for me is interesting beyond just El Salvador. Christine, have a go, and then I think I'm interested in the time left a bit to look forward, because I thought Ramiro made it really interesting about the economic picture, El Salvador's underperformance and extreme poverty and the desire of people. This is what will Bukele too be judged on prosperity living standards, not on crime and violence, and if so, can he be popular on that agenda rather than on the more draconian crime agenda? I think that's more forward looking. But Christine, come first, and then able to look forward to his second term. I'd be interested in people's thoughts, but Christine first.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to one of Ramiro's comments about regional comparisons. And I think that, and I won't speak for Ramiro on this, Antonella or Manuel, but when I say regional, I mean Central America. And so I think one of the dangers in comparing El Salvador to other countries in Central America is I don't think that we want El Salvador to be where other Central American countries are. Honduras is a narco state. We just watched a very protracted battle in Guatemala about whether or not a democratically elected president would actually be inaugurated. Nicaragua has descended into a full-blown dictatorship. These aren't great comparisons for El Salvador, right? The bottom doesn't have to be the comparison for this. I do think that the economic challenge, and I said this in my initial comments, is going to be the big one for Bukele in his second term. And there's no getting around it. I mean, the public deficit in El Salvador is incredible. It's unserviceable almost, or maybe it is. The country is almost completely reliant on remittances. Hunger and poverty are
This
up.
challenge, can he? Do you think he can? I mean, it's not going to succeed in terms of making El Salvador very prosperous, but in relative terms, is he going to move the dial on this agenda? In 5 years' time, will people say Bukele's second term was a success in terms of the economic prosperity agenda within reasonable expectation?
I mean, I think we have to hope so, but I think the reality is that we've really not seen this from Bukele during his first 5 years. Bitcoin is not something to hang your hat on in terms of poverty alleviation, despite the rhetoric about banking the unbanked, right? El Salvador desperately needs investment. It needs good jobs, but it also needs social investment and expenditures. And this is one of the things that Ramiro talked about. Maybe he'd say a bit more about how desperately underinvested El Salvador is in terms of its infrastructure and social spending in general.
Ramiro, you said this exactly the point Christine just made about the sort of underinvestment, but you also highlighted nearshoring and tourism as the two potentially big growth areas in Bukele too, if I can call it that. Do you see him delivering on that agenda? Do you think in 3 or 4 years' time people will be seeing him as having made certain progress?
The point is what needs to happen for him to deliver on that agenda. And what needs to happen is that you have a sharp increase in foreign direct investment because, as we have seen in the presentation, domestic savings are quite low. In order to increase domestic savings, external FDI, what you need is essentially to lower sovereign risk premium. And in order to do that, you need to do some work in terms of overhauling the fiscal accounts. And I disagree a little bit with Christine. In the past few years, Bukele, based on the massive popularity that he has gained with his success in fighting crime, he has been able to rebuild El Salvador's fiscal situation modestly. I mean, there's still work to be done. And essentially, the point is that going forward, it looks like from the point of view of what the kind of adjustment the IMF is suggesting, it looks like it seems quite feasible. I mean, he would only need to introduce an additional increase in taxes or cut in spending of 1 percentage point of GDP, which is half the fiscal effort that he has made up to 2022. It's true there has been some deterioration in 2023, because especially in December, because of the fact that we were in the electoral season. But this is capital spending that can be easily unwound. So the bottom line is that going forward, I think that he has good chances on delivering on the fiscal front and on being successful in terms of reducing sovereign spreads, especially because I'm going to say something that could be controversial, but look at what's happening in Argentina with Milei. He's struggling to put together his reform agenda. Why is that? Because he doesn't have support in Congress. So from the point of view of Bukele, he's virtually at this moment ruling unopposed. So if anyone has any chance of implementing any kind of reform at this point, it is Bukele. So considering that the size of the fiscal adjustment is not that demanding and that he has a significant position of power, I think that he has a very good chance in terms of delivering in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Manuel and Antonella. Any thoughts on this coming term and particularly the economic prospects? Can Bukele be a success, even if you can be pained that the process enabled him to be there, and still, I suppose, have an open-minded view on whether he is able to continue to manage very low murder rates by El Salvadoran standards and address the economic malaise. Any thoughts, Manuel or Antonella, or both?
Sure. I think there's a decent chance that he is able to do these things. I could sort of walk you through the kind of nightmare scenario for Bukele's second term in terms of these outcomes. I think in some ways what might be a little more interesting to think about is who the new enemy will be. And that might sound like a weird thing to say, but if you sort of analyze the way Bukele operates as a political actor, this is a story of constant wars, right? This began as a war against the political establishment. Then it became a war against COVID, which we tend to forget about. Then it became a war against gangs. All three of those wars are won. The key question is who becomes the new rhetorical and political enemy now that there really are none left. What we see in each of these periods is that this is not just rhetoric, right? The rhetoric sort of symbolizes what Bukele does underneath just.
In other words, I suppose, can you be a revolutionary when you won everything? You're no longer railing against the system; you are the system.
Yeah, and he can keep railing. Sure, and look, he can keep railing against the old elites, and he can keep railing against gangs. He probably will to some extent, but at some point, those things are going to start to exhaust themselves as a good way of maintaining an 85% popularity rate. Decent economic management of the kind I think Ramiro's envisioning, which is possible, might be consistent with, a 50-55% popularity rating or below. This is the president who wants to keep an 80 to 85% popularity rating. So I think in some ways, the question that we'll decide of the second term, in addition to the question of the economy, is who is the next enemy? What is the next chapter of this populist narrative that is central to everything that Bukele says and does? And I don't have a good answer. I could give you some suggestions, but they would all sound kind of crazy.
Antonella, do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, maybe yes. This totally reminds me a little bit of economic policies that are, I don't know, being discussed in Argentina and elsewhere. I think, yeah. So I think I'm more comfortable making this comparison with other Central American countries. Like El Salvador's economy is really mediocre. It has been not very good. It's the country, as Ramiro was showing us, that less foreign investment receives. I think this is something that, for example, worries the US. And so I think this will definitely be something that will maybe prevent him from implementing all the policies he'd like, as he has to negotiate a way to finance this increasing debt that the country seems to, I mean, it seems to be heading in that direction, right? So I think the US will have some leverage, the US and like organisms will have some leverage when negotiating with Bukele. That's
Thank you. I'm going to try and sum it up. Thank you for your comments, people in the chat. Try to incorporate a few of those themes into the discussion. It's difficult to summarize. I think I can summarize by saying that there was considerable concern amongst our panelists about the process of the election, not just the election, but more generally in El Salvador, constitutional propriety, whether the systems are being stress tested beyond their natural endurance levels, and the implications of disregarding process, even when it may appear attractive in terms of policies or short-term horizons. We can also, though, stop and reflect that I take the point some panelists make that the election had features which were unsatisfactory, but nevertheless, I don't think anybody seriously questions that Bukele has a high degree of popular support among the people of El Salvador. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes of that and how the country evolves in his second term. And particularly, I thought the focus on the sort of prime rule of law aspects versus the greater agenda of looking forward on economic progress, I think will be one to particularly look for. I suppose the crucial point for people not beyond El Salvador, what I find really interesting, and it has application right across just the democratic world, but the wider world, about process, rules of law, constitutional propriety. What is a democracy? I think nearly everybody would accept a democracy involves the demos demonstrating their preference, voting. But beyond that, what is the architecture of democracy that supports that process? And how does it function between elections? And I think the El Salvador election, more than any recently, has shone a very sort of sharp light on what people's understanding of democracy is and the rule of law and how it should apply. And I think it's interesting in a wider Latin American context, because there's a lot of immature democracies, a lot of anxiety about the abuse of executive power. But it's also part of the world with less than 10% of the world's population and about 30% of the world's murders. So there is also a desire to see, in areas like stark areas like that, politicians, leaders who are able to move the dial and make dramatic change. Right. I don't know if that's a good summary. It's just reasons to be interested in El Salvador, I think. But thank you very much, Christine, Ramiro, Antonella, Manuel. What we tried to have is a sort of lively, thought-provoking conversation. And please come. We've got lots on at Canning House. Many of the things are online, not all of them, but when they are, they're all publicized on our website. We exist to try and raise interest in and awareness of Latin America, particularly here in Britain, and the panel today and all of you watching have contributed to that process. So thank you very much for all of your time, and goodbye.